Okay, folks, I think that's probably everybody's here, and this is going to be, it sounds as if it's going to be far too loud, but anyway, with the microphone on. So, my name's Keith Hunter. I'm Professor of Head and Neck Pathology in the Liverpool Head and Neck Centre. I am a histopathologist by background, by my clinical background, and I specialise mostly in head and neck cancer. And I guess one of the reasons why I've been kind of asked to do this lecture is I spend quite a lot of my time overseeing elements of ethical use of tissues and so on in research. And I'm about to take over as the academic lead for biobanking for the university. And so a large part of some of the historically interesting bits, and I'm not talking about centuries historical, I'm talking about recent history, are unfortunately focused around Liverpool. So we're going to talk a little bit about them in terms of some of the problems that there's been ethically. So, let's see if it's on. So I really just want to start off with saying a little bit about what bioethics is generally. We're going to talk a little bit about what people think about when you raise the idea of bioethics and ethics in general. And then some of the problems that arise from that. And then I'm going to focus it down a little bit into my own area of interest in terms of how we ethically use human material in research. And that's a large part of elements that you're going to have to deal with in terms of developing your clinical trial stuff that you're doing for your next assignment and so on. So it's really genuinely quite important. So bioethics covers a huge area of clinical practice and research practice. There are areas of massive controversy, as we will see as we go through, things that perhaps if I were to go round every one of you in this room, you would actually have a different opinion on. And that's really quite important, because then if you take a step back from ethics, you get into the whole area of your own values. And your own values and how they relate to the values of society. And your own values, you will, whether you like it or not, and whether you acknowledge it or not, come to life in all of its aspects with a worldview. And that will be informed by your upbringing, by your religious background, by whether you're religious or humanist, a whole different area of things. They will inform your values. And these very similar types of things also inform the values of the society in which we live. And so there's a large part of it which is really very interesting in terms of its background. But ethics is a branch of philosophy that defines both social and individual morality. So it does come down to a certain extent to you and your own values and how you then express these values within your life in terms of your own morality, and also then how that transfers into society. And you might find in certain areas of your own individual morality and the ethics that you have that it will agree with the general ethical view of the society in which we live, which, as you're probably well aware, is changing very rapidly. And also you might find that there's agreement and disagreement. And then another definition is whether it refers to well-founded standards of right and wrong. Now, we could stop there and we could discuss that, because when you've got standards of right and wrong, which is this whole idea of well-founded, you've got to ask the question, right, well, where did they come from? What are the underlying principles behind that? And we'll see, I'm going to present to you a number of underlying principles for bioethics. But again, this whole idea of where they have come from, describing what humans ought to do in terms of rights, obligations, benefits to society's fairness and specific values. And these things, which are very important concepts in their own right, sometimes agree and sometimes end up in conflict. Now, I do not have any qualification in psychology or anything like that. So please, if any of you do have a background in psychology, please be kind to me. But there are various ethical theories in terms of overall structures. Now, this is not comprehensive, but it gives you an idea of the overall worldview that we're looking at here. And you'll see some of you'll understand these three areas in general. So there's an ethical theory which is known as utilitarianism. And in essence, the concept of utilitarianism is if you're viewing on something of whether it is ethically correct or not, or ethically allowable, that it is viewed primarily in the view of how that benefits society as a whole. Now, you can probably think of examples of how things which might benefit society as a whole will, as a side effect of them, be to the non-benefit or even the detriment of certain parts of society. It's the general societal benefit that comes from it, but that might actually disenfranchise some individuals. And you only have to have a look at certain elements of government policy and see how they are running that all the time. Whatever things that comes out in the budget in terms of things which are going to benefit us, you look then on the BBC website and you will see, well, how much does that benefit society as a whole? But then you can see how it benefits or might not actually benefit you at all. And so it is with various ethical things. So that utilitarianism focuses primarily on the benefit to society. Sorry. Then there's deontology, which is the fulfillment of duty. Now that is a very different way of looking at things. Now that does not focus upon the outcome. It focuses upon the way things are done. The standards of right and wrong that we had in the previous slide, are we applying them properly? And sometimes in applying the standards of right and wrong, the outcome might not be particularly pleasant. But deontology focuses upon that process of applying these principles of right and wrong, regardless of what the outcome is. And then consequentialism, which in fact many of us live certain aspects of our life this way, which essentially is the end justifies the means. That as long as the end is useful, it actually doesn't matter which way you get there. And you can see across these that in fact you come up with so many examples of how these things might actually conflict. So what are the ethical principles? We said if there are ethical principles and they are these well-founded principles of right and wrong, which would then flow into bioethics and clinical practice and so on in other areas. There are 4. And these are the ones you will find in any of the main texts. They are autonomy. And we're going to step through these eventually as to what they all mean. Beneficence. And then the other side of that coin is non-maleficence. That's essentially doing good and not doing harm. And then justice. So these are the 4 main bioethical principles that you will find in almost any of the textbooks in terms of and how they are applied. Now, I have added 2 of them, not just off my own back, but because they are very often placed into the context with the other 4. And these are truthfulness, which you could argue is part of justice, and confidentiality. And these are particularly important, I think, in relation to add to this for bioethics, for reasons that we shall see. So if someone mentions ethics to you, what kind of things come into your mind? Anybody going to chuck anything in?
Consent.
Yeah, consent. I think that's very important. Anything else?
Rules.
Yeah, rules and how we apply them. And very often, in fact, when people talk about ethics, they'll go to things like we will see that the difficult decisions that have to be made and the cases that make the front line of the newspapers. Or perhaps they'll think of various scandals. So some people do think of scandals primarily when they're thinking about ethics. Now, I'm going to bring you some examples. And some of these examples are difficult. Okay, and I'll just give you a little bit of a warning for that. So the first of these scandals is this one, which some of you may have heard of or not. And this is referred to as the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, which ran in Alabama in the United States from a little bit before the pre-World War II era, right up until, well, in fact, the year before I was born. So actually, it's relatively recent history. You would probably disagree. But what happened was that the medical establishment in the southern United States wanted some clear information on the natural history of syphilis infection. I don't know how much you've had in terms of understanding. Syphilis is a very complex infection. It comes in a number of phases. There are acute phases and chronic phases. There are congenital variants because it can be transferred in utero and so on. It's a very complex infective disease. And they wanted to know what the natural history was. What happens in an individual if you can observe them closely, if you just let syphilis run? Now the thing is, of course, by the time you got to 1932, penicillin had been identified. So there was an effective treatment for syphilis. So this is where the problem arises. when they made a decision not to treat known syphilis cases so they could observe the natural history of the infection in an individual and also in a society. So that ran over several decades in poor black populations in the southern United States. And they weren't treated. They underwent numbers of procedures, diagnostic procedures and so on, that they would not have had to have. And it ran all the way until it was formally closed by the government, the federal government of the United States, in 1972. So there are a number of main ethical issues, as you can imagine, that arise from that. The lack of informed consent and the lack of respect for human rights and dignity. They were not told that there was something in terms of a condition they had that was treatable, and they were not told that they could be treated, nor were they told that treatment was available and treatment wasn't being given to them. So there was a complete disregard of the autonomy of the individual. And the rights to do that, the fundamental human rights and dignity associated with that. So autonomy, in terms of the ability of the individual to determine what is done to them and so on, was completely ignored. Withholding of treatment for research purposes. Well, that contravenes both beneficence and non-maleficence. You always have to seek to be doing the best for a patient. So that means in this case, if they have a diagnosis and there is a treatment, that the treatment should be provided. But also, in withholding that, they're actually doing harm to the patient. So there's something even worse than just not doing what is right. So that's gone as well. And of course, truth, justice and truthfulness were very much a casualty in this. There was no openness, there was no honesty in relation to how this was being conducted. And so justice, the natural justice that you would expect in this circumstance, given the imbalance of power that you very much have in the circumstance between the community which was being experimented on and the medical community, when the justice and truthfulness were gone. There are many other examples. This is a relatively more recent one, but it also started many decades ago, and this was in New Zealand. And this again is a doctor, an obstetrician gynecologist of very great renown called Herbert Green, who did not believe that carcinoma in situ was precancerous. So that's the changes in the cervix, which are dysplasia. They massively increase the risk of cervical carcinoma. We understand that now. But he did not believe that. He thought that was a dogma which was unsubstantiated. And so he had a cohort of women patients who had CIS of the cervix that he just observed. And again, there are a number of these, it's not a surprise to you, developed invasive cervical carcinoma. When they could have been treated by various means in terms of ablating the cervix, LETS biopsies and so on, to stop that happening. And again, that was made the news big style in New Zealand not really that long ago. And in fact, that it's a situation which is not properly resolved yet. And then we come to Liverpool. Now this was something that happened about the time when I started pathology training. And it became apparent that there was, within the pathology department at Alderhay Hospital, a process particularly focused upon one pathologist who was retaining organs and tissues from the post-mortems of children without consent and without the parents having any knowledge of the parts of the bodies of their children were being retained. And as you can imagine, when the newspapers got a hold of this, that this was a scandal, and this broke around about the late kind of 1990s. There was a Royal Liverpool Children's Inquiry related to that, and a lot went on in terms of a public inquiry. And this was a particular problem for us when I was in my early years of pathology training, in terms of the public view of pathologists. We were all perceived to being monsters and effectively like the body snatchers of centuries ago. This changed the way that we view the use of human tissue in research in this country dramatically. So the violations of public trust, which ended up with all these bodies and parts of children's bodies being retained in Alderhay Hospital, opened up the whole thing of pathology in the UK, and it was found that there was a huge amount of human material that was being retained in departments, not only pathology departments, but biological research departments like this, without the consent of the patients, without anybody knowing exactly what was happening to it. And the law allowed it to happen, because the law, in terms of the use of human tissues, was from 1832, which was put into place largely as a result of all these sort of things of the body snatchers. And if any of you have actually ever been to the Surgeons Museum in Edinburgh, which I'll come to in a minute, you might see some of the legacy of that. But there are so many other examples. The NHS selling skin for chemical weapons research, drug companies paying for dead infants' gland, and horrendous stories from across the States about the owners of funeral homes selling off bits of body to biological research, and then the bodies were then buried for the families. It's just horrendous. The other thing that some people think of in terms of bioethics is paternalism, and I wondered about putting this up now because, you know, House is part of my TV watching. I don't know whether it's any part of you guys. It's probably set into history. It has now. Okay, some of you still do watch House. Okay. And, you know, the whole idea of just the doctor swanning in, doing something weird and wonderful that the patient doesn't know anything about, cures everything, you know, cures everything in the world, everything's right and everything like that, but it's pure paternalism on the TV screen. You know, the doctor knows best, and my mother-in-law perhaps is the best example of that. She would do it. The doctor told us that she would do anything. You know, just because she came from that generation which is very much focused upon the effects of paternalism, and the doctor knows best. But it goes over into evidence-based medicine as well, and the whole foundation of medical practice and how we do things, why we do things the way we do them, and whether it's just because we've always done them that way, or whether there is a solid evidential base for what we do, and that applies to clinical practice as much as it does to research. So modern medicine itself, in terms of bioethics, we pursue being evidence-based, patient-centered, with shared decision-making, consent at the center of a whole load of what we do in clinical practice. And the fact that in terms of when areas sometimes things are difficult, that the doctor should be able to and willing to justify why they would say to a patient that they would think one way or another was better in a particular difficult circumstance. And so paternalism still has its tentacles amongst us, unfortunately. And so we have moved in the last 2 decades, particularly, I think, to evidence-based ethics, and particularly in medicine, that we know that at times when you have a patient in front of you, that if you may well have scientific and technical judgments to make. Now that is just a case of, you know, when you're coming to decide which drug you might prescribe for a patient, or which surgical procedure you might give in a particular circumstance, that there is an evidence base for it. But hopefully it's a clinical trial. You guys are going to be designing your clinical trial. You know, and it's for this whole idea of you giving a solid evidential base for what you might actually do for a patient. But then there are also value judgments, and this is the thing which is in many ways much more difficult to try and nail down. You know, and I don't know, some of you, and I know Jack's been in the head and neck MDT, I don't know if any of the rest of you had the opportunity to go to any of the MDTs if you're involved in any of the clinical areas, but there's discussions at times of patients who have very extensive cancers, and that discussion is not necessarily over the technical and scientific merits of what happens, but it's this whole idea of value and what is a quality of life and what is in the best interest of the patient. And so these value judgments particularly are things which cannot be made as decisions in isolation. They have to be made as a shared decision-making process with the patient. Because who am I then in isolation to say anything about the quality of life and the best interest for any individual? So there's that tension is always there. And whilst we get good evidence into the scientific and technical judgments, the value judgments are much more difficult. But nonetheless, we are focusing upon providing evidence-based, patient-centered clinical practice and being able to justify what we bring to a patient in terms of options. And so these are brought together in a number of different publications about ethical frameworks and all the things that you got to put into this decision-making process. Now, the medical indications, and that's much more the scientific and technical part of it. The patient may have a particular set of blood tests which are showing something. It's there. It's not up for discussion. The data is there. But then there's patient preferences, quality of life, other contextual features, including the economics of it and family circumstances, cultural factors, religious factors, all these sort of things go on. And so the scientific part of which you've got your good solid evidential base in terms of making a solid decision, a bioethically sound decision for a patient or even in a research related area, does extend beyond into things that's very difficult to get a good solid evidential base. Some people think of arguments, and there are things I'm sure that if we were to go through a number of topical ethical things that you would have a range of opinions on across the room in terms of whether you eat meat or not, whether that's an ethical issue. Evidence of the ongoing raging discussions about abortion, whether that is legal, should be legal or not. And you will all have your, I'm sure, fairly well-founded views one way or another on these things. But even though you think a lot of ethics is centered around argument, when it comes down to it, we generally agree in quite a lot, even if you have a very different worldview. We would agree within medical practice or even within research, biological research practice, that you agree with being honest, you agree with being patient-centered, that you maintain high standards of confidentiality, that patients are provided with information related to their decisions, and that competent patients can refuse. And this is this whole idea largely of being patient-centered, focusing upon the autonomy of the patient and affecting their rights and their dignity. And then there are difficult cases, and this is the one that, again, we could stop and have a discussion about difficult cases, and there are so many examples of them. Current unresolved ethical issues in society in relation to the right to die, and so on, and the ethics of that. And of course the ethics, it's not just the ethics of it, it is the legal aspects of it as well, which are in some ways very difficult. Again, you may well have fairly strong views on this, or you may not, but these are difficult situations that unfortunately, in many cases we're finding it is the courts that end up deciding what happens in these circumstances, and I think in many ways that's perhaps not the right place for these decisions to end up. So day-to-day practice in research and also in medicine will provide you circumstances in which there is no agreement, but you of course you still have to then think back, you take a step back into these 4 ethical principles and try and apply them in a way which is reasonable and into the circumstance of the particular patient or research circumstance that you have in front of you. And at times there is direct conflict between these ethical principles, there is no doubt about that. If you think that the patient has a right to choose and you believe in the autonomy of the patient, but then if you present to the patient a particular course of treatment which you feel is the maximally benefit to one, and they decide that they are going to refuse that, so you then have a conflict between beneficence and autonomy, and how then do you resolve that? And again, unfortunately, at times that ends up in the court. And then we have incoming new technologies, genome editing, AI, and the ethics of a magazine editor commissioning an article which is supposed to be an interview with Michael Schumacher, but in fact was actually completely generated by AI. And that's a magazine editor who lost his job last week over that. And so the ethics of these things, these are still very much balls in play at the moment in terms of the ethics of all these things. And the ethics of using ChatGPT for your essays, etc., etc. So there are current balls in play in bioethics, genetically modified organisms, biotechnology, nanotechnology, end-of-life questions like we've just talked about, organ trafficking, which you might not think is a big problem in the Western world, but I tell you it is. Certainly in certain parts of the less developed parts of the world, organ trafficking is a big deal. Protecting the integrity of participants in therapeutic trials, environmental ethics, the ethics of Extinction Rebellion, and so on. Again, we could stop and have a chat about that. Again, many of you may have an opinion on that. Biodiversity and what we're doing to our planet, human cloning, assisted procreation. And so these are things which are going to have to be grappled with and have to some clear ethical principles in moving forward. And then if any of you are looking for anything which is further reading, the Nuffield Council on Bioethics have some really good resources on their website to have a look at. But this is what they see as kind of like the next decade of the bioethical issues which our society is going to have to deal with. And you'll see, for example, things like when we get to health and society, the top one there, cryogenic freezing after death. But of course, there are certain areas in the States that you can apply to be and pay to be cryogenically frozen on your death, waiting that time when it's going to be 3 centuries from now when they find the cure to whatever killed you and they can actually bring you back to life again. I think that would just be horrendous, to be honest, but never mind. But so many different aspects there of ethical issues which are not going to go away. So we're back at these bioethical principles and how we apply these into the circumstance of medicine, bioethics, and also biological research. So autonomy, as we've seen, is that whole idea of that the patient is an autonomous individual. They have rights and responsibilities of their own. They have, if they are competent, of course, that's another discussion to be had in terms of whether a patient is able to make decisions on a rational basis. And they are, after having been given appropriate information, that they can then make decisions. And autonomy is part of the overarching area that brings us to consent and so on. And the whole idea of informed consent and what patients need to know, what they should be told ahead of things which happen to them. And at times that will conflict, patient autonomy and medical knowledge will conflict in terms of many different areas of what patients hold as values and their background and so on. Then there's justice, the idea that we would treat and provide care fairly to all patients. And this also applies to research, that we would also allow patients from across all areas equal access to research. You only have to have a look at some of the clinical trial data, and again, it might be something for you to deal with in your clinical trial. How do you ensure that, in fact, your trial population is representative? How do you make sure that it has the correct gender and ethical, ethnic, and so on, makeup to it that actually makes it applicable widely? And there's a lot of data out there showing that, in fact, in terms of socioeconomics and ethnicity and so on, that there is not justice in terms of access to either medical care or also in access to research and clinical trials and so on. So justice can be a problem. Beneficence, making sure that the choices for a patient are for their good, and the other side of that being that you do no harm, non-maleficence. But of course, many treatments have side effects, and it's making sure that the positive effects that you have for a particular course of action with a patient outweigh the negative effects that it may have. But again, in terms of autonomy, the patient has a right to know that. And then truthfulness. When do you tell the truth? And those of you who are pursuing medicine will come up against examples of this. Of patients who don't want to know the truth, or relatives who don't want you to tell the truth to their patients, particularly to the elderly patients, and so on. And so again, there is ethical issues in relation to that. But in general, we are called upon to be honest and scrupulously honest, and to hold up our hands when we get it wrong, as well as another part of our duty of candour to patients. And then confidentiality. A very important principle of biomedicine and research in terms of how we maintain patients' anonymity in the circumstances, and so that in research and so on that they cannot be identified, and that we have a responsibility, those of us working in healthcare, for absolute confidentiality. Well, I say absolute, but it's not absolute, is it? There are certain circumstances that you do have to be able to break confidentiality if there's a greater public. We go back to some of these ethical principles at the beginning in terms of the overall societal need, which might at times be seen as a greater need than the need of the individual. So here's one. I don't know if any of you have come across this. I'm just interested to know your views on this. Henrietta Lacks. Any of you heard of Henrietta Lacks? Yeah, I think it's now been fairly well discussed. I have HeLa cells in my lab, and we have used them for many years. They were generated from her in 1951. And so there is now more of Henrietta Lacks alive in labs around the world than there ever was when she was alive in the 1950s and the early part of her life. And that was done without any consent, any knowledge of her or the family that these cells from her cervical cancer were going to be grown. And now they have been used, and there's probably, it's not an exaggeration to say that there are certain biotech companies and pharmaceutical companies have made millions, perhaps even billions of pounds and dollars using these cells to be able to generate new therapies, new knowledge, and so on. So what ethical issues does that raise? Is this one of these things that the end justifies the means? Where is the problem in this? Yeah, so the whole idea of autonomy has been completely sidelined in here. So, yeah, beneficence. So, well, there's certainly. She was treated for her cancer. Beneficence is perhaps the one that you maybe could just about get away with because she was treated. It's not as if she was not treated. But there's certainly a contravention of non-maleficence in that. Justice? Very little justice in this, really, I think, isn't there? You know, justice in terms of the family and so on. And now I think there are some amount of at least acknowledgement of that, but whether you can actually make any sort of meaningful reparations to a family in relation to this, I really don't know. And so it's interesting, and I put my hands up and say I have the cells in my lab and we use them because I work with human papillomavirus in the head and neck, so they're a very useful control cell to have. But these are things that I wonder at times, maybe should I have them? The one thing which is an interesting side effect of HeLa cells, because they grow fabulously well. If you're going to learn how to do cell culture, you learn using HeLa cells because they grow in just about everything. That unfortunately means that they have overgrown so many other different cell cultures that people think are their precious cells, but in fact they've just been overgrown by HeLa. And there's been lots of papers that have had to be withdrawn because in fact all the people have been thinking that they've been using their wonderful rare cancer cell when in fact they've just been experimenting on HeLa cells. So, interesting. So what about biological issues in research? And yes, some of you will be at that interface between biological research and medical practice. Some of you might go into full-time biological research. And there is a certain element of which you'll find front pages like Time, that's from a few years ago now, complaining that a lot of these ethical principles that we have seen are just being contravened, and humans have or are becoming glorified laboratory guinea pigs. And you can imagine that there is a large body of evidence, which I don't agree with. It's not evidence, so it's a body of opinion in relating to how the COVID vaccines were developed and so on. Again, you'll find a lot out there written about the fact that we are just human guinea pigs in that regard. I do not agree with that, but there's a lot out there, particularly on social media, about it. And so, research ethical principles cover a number of areas, as you can see here. And there are these four main practices of minimizing harmful practices. That's non-maleficence, consents, autonomy, confidentiality, avoid misleading practices. And these areas here, which extend more widely than a lot of things which directly affect patients, and it's things like responsible publication, intellectual property. Now that's come back to this whole idea of HeLa cells and the intellectual property that comes from that, but of course none of that has come to the family. Legality of it, honesty, social responsibility in terms of the results that you have, integrity, openness, care of animals, which is another area which we haven't really gone into because animals are quite widely used still in biological research, and being objective and dealing with your potential sources of bias. So in terms of human tissues, and I'm going to bring it down to the area which is a particular research interest to me, there's a using human tissues and accessing human tissues and using human tissues ethically is really very important to be able to do that. And these are the sort of things that you can use human tissue for. There's a lot that's been done in animal research over the years, but to actually use human tissues gives you something that's directly relevant to the disease that you're looking at and helps to reduce the use of animals in research. And I think all of us would want to do that as much as is possible. And so our whole areas here in terms of cell culture and so on, and being able to take individual cells or using pieces of tissue, all the things that we can do in the laboratory, and some of you may well be doing some of this in your projects, whether doing cell culture or whether you'll be using fixed tissue and looking at histochemistry and being able to image that and so on. And you can see here. So there's a huge range of things that you can do with human tissue, but it's very important that it's done on a basis which is completely ethical. And of course, that was not always the case. And you'll see old pictures from many years ago in terms of the public post-mortems that went on back in medieval times. And this is cartoonized, obviously, but nonetheless, you can see how things like the intestines being fed to the dog underneath the table and so on. And it's a bit of an exaggeration, but I don't think there was very good practice going on in a lot of these. Nonetheless, the anatomists, and this is a painting which some of you might have seen if you've been to Amsterdam and been to the Rijksmuseum. It's a Rembrandt picture called The Anatomist in terms of the teaching. And this is how they have learned and use of human tissues and human bodies to progress the knowledge of humans. And this has been really very, very important. But again, you wonder at times in terms of the understanding of the modern ethical principles that we've just gone through, how much of that was attended to. And then you come to the nonsense which went around for many years in terms of the body snatchers and so on. That, of course, once you find that this is something which is needed, that the progress of human understanding requires the human bodies and dissection and so on, you're going to find somebody who's enterprising who will actually then make money, providing you with the bodies so you can do this. And there are ways that perhaps are sort of ethical of doing it, perhaps bodies that may well be donated in some way, but very often that's just going to end up in the fact that you're going to get people who are going to start murdering people to provide bodies. And this whole story of Burke and Hare in Edinburgh is one of these. And they murdered and supplied 30 corpses preserved in whisky to the medical school in Edinburgh. And they were eventually caught. But it's not an isolated case either, and people were making significant money off this. And if any of you do go to the Surgical Museum, the College of Surgeons Museum in Edinburgh, you will see this. And this is Burke's death mask. And if you wanted something which is really pretty grotesque, this little leather-bound notebook here is made, well, the leather is his skin. It's all just a bit, yeah. So this brought us to the Anatomy Act, I said, from the 1830s, and that was in force through all the problems that we had in Liverpool and in other areas in the UK about tissues not being gathered and used in an ethical manner. And so we now have the Human Tissue Act. This had to be updated, had to bring us up into the current century in terms of being able to access and use tissue. And so the Human Tissue Act, which is now in force, regulates tissue from the deceased and the living. And so removal, storage and use of tissue from the deceased, and storage and use of tissue from the living. So any of you who are going to be using tissue in your projects, so one of the questions you should be asking of your supervisor is, are all the things in place that this has been done ethically? Is it in keeping with the Human Tissue Act? And the overarching principle of this is consent. And I think it's a very important place where we started way back at the beginning. Consent is very important. And if you want to do research on tissue samples that, for example, you want to know what happened to that patient. So you've got a bit of their tumour, you want to know if biomarker A, B and C is there, and then of course you want to be able to go back 5 years later and find out if they had A and B, if they died from disease, but if they had A, B and C, that they lived, all that sort of thing. You need to have information that allows you to go back to patient information. It needs to be linked to the patient. And so if you're going to do that, you're going to need consent. There are other projects in the way that they can do things that allows us, if we anonymize the samples, we can use them more widely. And a lot of the stuff that we do, and certainly stuff that are done in my laboratory, is done on material that's been anonymized, which we can then use with more generic consent rather than specific consent that's needed for this. And the body which was formed to enforce this is the Human Tissue Authority, and they come round and they inspect us. They make sure that we are doing exactly as we want. So they'll go into the files and say, okay, here's a consent form for Joe Bloggs, and he had a sample of prostate cancer taken in 2016. Can you show me exactly what you've got from that, where it is? Can you show me the records of which researchers had it, and so on? And so we have to have a system in place to be able to do that so that everything is completely followable through and it's done on an ethical basis. And similarly, these samples that these patients give to us for research, they don't belong to us. They still belong to the patient. And so again, under freedom of information, the patients are going to be entitled to be able to write to us and ask exactly what's happened to the sample that they put in for research. So it becomes a much more open and transparent way of using tissue. And I think Professor Shaw is going to talk to you a little bit about the formal consent process and ethical approval and how we get the regulatory aspects of tissue and research and so on. Because some of you may well need to be attending to these sort of things depending on your clinical trial. For example, if any of you are going to do a phase 1 study or phase 0 even, something which is first in man, the MHRA are going to want to know about that in terms of stuff that's not approved yet for human use. So there is an ethical summary for tissue-based research. Informed consent is very important, and that presents the patient the details of the project. There's no pressure on them to participate. They're free to withdraw at any time and so on. We must avoid causing harm to them. So you can't say, yeah, okay, Mrs. Smith, we would really quite like to have some of your tissue from your cancer. But in fact, what we also need is a huge amount of your normal tissue as well. So we're going to take that as well. And that's not going to fly. So you've got to avoid making harm. Maintaining anonymity and confidentiality, avoiding biases, is a huge part of clinical trial design. And taking particular care in research in vulnerable groups, kids, prisoners, those who are not able to give consent, and so on. And we're back at our principles. Maintaining autonomy, beneficence and non-maleficence, justice and truthfulness, and confidentiality. Lastly, I want to talk something which, again, is something I find very interesting and rather sad, which has become more and more to my attention over the last few years, and that is research misconduct, unethical conduct in research. There is a lot of pressure in biotech and also even within universities to produce results. And this has resulted in, unfortunately, a lot of fabrication, falsification, plagiarism in all aspects of research. And we classify research misconduct in a number of different areas. Misconduct that distorts scientific knowledge, that's fabrication, reporting of non-existent data. So that's for your PCR, that you might have some data, but you essentially just go in and fill in numbers made up. You're just making up data. That's adding an extra band in using Photoshop in your Western blot. Excellent. Selective reporting of data. That's a big issue. If you come across data that you don't actually like or doesn't fit with your story, we'll just forget about that. And this is a big problem, I think, in selective reporting of data. Negative trials from the pharmaceutical industry, they get buried. It's unethical. Misconduct that leaves the scientific community, that's related to authorship and publication and so on. So that misconduct relating to human subjects in relation to lack of consent, exploitation of people, and other issues, conflict of interest, poor record keeping, failure to have all the regulatory things in place, and non-reporting of incidental findings. Non-reporting of incidental findings is an interesting one. Again, you could spend some time discussing that. Some of the biggest steps forward in human medicine have actually been incidental findings. Findings of proton pump inhibitors and so on, all these sort of things, and benzodiazepines and so on, they're all found by accident. So I wanted to bring you an example, which is one which to say I was involved with is overstating it, but this is a guy who was very active at the time when I was doing my PhD. So he was a guy who was working in oral cancer, and he was very interested in these white and red patches in the mouth that develop into mouth cancer. And I see them in my clinical practice. They're biopsied, they have tissue architecture changes that we call dysplasia, but it's very difficult to get a real grasp on which ones of these that are dysplastic are going to develop cancer, which ones are not. And he managed to come up with a test using an image cytometry machine that he used that managed to predict which ones are going to progress to cancer. Just mind-blowingly, amazingly good. And he had lots of papers, including 4 New England Journal of Medicine papers that were the highest cited papers for many years in the whole field of oral cancer. And he was a rising star, essentially. And I met him at a number of conferences, and you know, charming, and he was a really quite inspirational character. And in 2005, he published a paper, again, largely in a Norwegian cohort, that, unfortunately for him, the Norwegian health minister's sister noted in the paper that, in fact, the clinical data for these 900 patients he could not have had access to. It had not been released from to any researchers at all. And effectively what he had done is that he had made up the whole thing. He had generated 900 fake patients. And in fact, when you went back through the data all the way back to his PhD, you found there was multiple instances of fabrication and falsification of data. Which meant that, in fact, all of his high-impact papers, of which my then boss was on one of them with him, and has his papers, and he had his PhD retracted, and he is now working as a dentist north of the Arctic Circle, very much with his tail between his legs. But you know, but you can imagine these things like that. Okay, he was caught, and it's pretty drastic what he's done. But one of the main problems that has flown from that is that in oral cancer and head and neck cancer research in general, he's tainted the rest of us in terms of people view a whole lot of things in terms of particularly prediction of pre-malignant transformation, which Professor Shaw and I work in, is always viewed very much with suspicion. And so we found that a difficult area to work in, not because of what he did. Any of you are interested, any of you are active on Twitter, follow this lady. This is Elizabeth Bick, and she essentially forensically dissects papers that are out there and shows you exactly who's been essentially chopping up Western blot bands and putting together Western blots that never occurred, have been rotating and copying photographs of cells and then presenting them as different. It's a forensic analysis of essentially just people trying to con people during the figures in their papers. It's kind of scary. So what about this one? This is perhaps fairly straightforward. Scenario number 2. Is he justified? What is this? Is there an example of? That's fabrication. Yeah, that's just making up result, and that is unethical. So it's a plea to you, as you perhaps in your research projects start your research careers, that you do so with a mind to the highest levels of integrity. Yes, there's pressure, there might even be some pressure from your supervisors to come up with good results. And I like my students to come up with good results, but not like this. So that's me done, and I guess it's been a quick So through many ways to think ethics that appeal to me and interest me, but I think we've covered the general principles, and it's up to you to some extent in terms to reflect on that, to go the step back beyond the ethics into your own values and have some thought about that and how they then affect the way that you will act. Those of you who are following a clinical pathway as clinicians, and also how that might affect how you do clinical research, and any of you who are researchers in terms of pure biological researchers or in any other field, how you do that ethically. So thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, or given the fact that it's ethics, if you have any bricks to throw at me, any things you disagreed with, please do so. Stunned silence.